Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this documentary is intended to discuss the case of Helen Bailey, respectfully and factually. Our thoughts remain with Helen's family and everyone affected by the events that we're about to cover. This case became one of the most shocking murder investigations in modern Britain, not because of the dramatic crime scene, but because of where the investigators eventually found the truth. For weeks, a successful author appeared to have simply vanished. Her fiancé spoke publicly about his concern. Searches were carried out, appeals were made, and yet, the answer was sitting much closer than anyone realised. This is the story of Helen Bailey. Helen Bailey was a well-known writer, best recognised for her young adult fiction, and later for a series of successful memoir-style books. Friends described her as intelligent, humorous and resilient. After experiencing personal tragedy earlier in life, she had rebuilt her career and found success as an author. By 2016, she was living in the village of Royston, Hertfordshire, with her fiancé, Ian Stewart. From the outside, their life appeared to be settled and comfortable. Nothing suggested that within days, Helen would disappear without explanation. In April 2016, friends and family began noticing something unusual. Helen was no longer responding to messages. Phone calls went unanswered. Her social media actively stopped. For someone who was normally in regular contact with those close to her, the silence was concerning. As the days passed, concern turned to alarm. Eventually, she was reported missing. Once the disappearance became public, Ian Stewart appeared deeply worried. He gave interviews and appealed for information. He told reporters that he did not know where Helen was and urged everyone with knowledge of her whereabouts to come forward. To many watching the news, he appeared to be concerned and desperately seeking answers. At that stage, investigators had no body, no obvious crime scene, and no clear indication of what had happened. Could Helen have left voluntarily? Did she suffer an accident? Or was something far more sinister involved? Detectives began retracing Helen's final known movements. They examined phone records, bank activity, CCTV footage, and witness statements. One of the first things that they noticed was that there was very little evidence of Helen living her normal life after the date she was believed to have disappeared. Her financial activity stopped, her communication stopped, and there was no reliable evidence that she had travelled anywhere. Investigators began to suspect that this was not a voluntary disappearance. Attention gradually turned to the home Helen shared with Ian Stewart. Officers conducted searches of the property. At first, nothing immediately obvious was found, but detectives later continued to examine the house carefully. As they did, certain inconsistencies in Stewart's account began to attract attention. Questions were raised about timelines, movements, and what had happened in the days after Helen was last seen. The investigation was becoming increasingly focused. Then, several months after Helen disappeared, detectives returned to the property for a far more extensive search. This time, they examined an area underneath the garage, and what they found stunned everyone involved in the investigation. Hidden in a cesspit underneath the house were remains of Helen Bailey and her dog. This woman, the woman who had been subject to public appeals, media searches, and missing persons investigations, had been concealed beneath her own home. And the man who had publicly pleaded for information was now at the centre of a murder investigation. Detectives arrested Ian Stewart. As they examined the evidence, they began building a case that would eventually reveal a disturbing motive involving money, deception, and careful planning. But there was another detail that made the investigation even more unsettling. Years earlier, Stewart's previous wife, Diane Stewart, had also died unexpectedly, and investigators would soon begin asking whether that death had really been an accident. As detectives examined the evidence, prosecutors began building a picture of what they believed had happened. They alleged that Ian Stewart had murdered Helen in April 2016 and then concealed her body in the cesspit beneath the garage of their home. According to the prosecution, this was not a crime committed in panic, it was a calculated act. And the motive, they argued, was financial. Helen Bailey had substantial assets, including property, savings, and the proceeds of her successful career in writing. Investigators discovered that after her disappearance, Stewart had made efforts to access aspects of her financial affairs. To prosecutors, this was the evidence that money had become a driving factor. For months, while Helen's family and friends desperately searched for her, Stewart had continued presenting himself as a worried partner. He spoke to the media. He appealed for information. He discussed the uncertainty surrounding her disappearance. But behind the scenes, detectives were uncovering a very different story. Forensic examinations of the property, digital evidence, and witness statements began to contradict his account. The timeline of Helen's disappearance became increasingly difficult for Stewart to explain. In 2017, Ian stood trial for the murder of Helen Bailey. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Helen could not have simply have vanished. They argued that she had been killed and hidden beneath the house, while Stewart attempted to maintain the appearance of a missing person case. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, but the central facts were difficult to dispute. Helen's remains had been found concealed on the property where Stewart lived, and the jury heard evidence suggesting that he had taken steps to mislead both investigators and those closest to Helen. After hearing the evidence, the jury found Ian guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term before he could be considered for parole. For many cases, that would have been the end. But as investigators looked more closely at Stewart's past, another death came under scrutiny. His previous wife, Diane Stewart, had died in 2010. At that time, her death had been treated as a tragic accident caused by an epileptic seizure while driving. However, after the conviction for Helen Bailey's murder, detectives reopened the case. They began asking whether Diane's death was really accidental. Investigators re-examined medical evidence, witness accounts, and the circumstances around Diane's death. Prosecutors eventually alleged that Ian Stewart had deliberately caused the crash that killed her. The theory was chillingly similar to the motive alleged in Helen's case. It was financial gain. Once again, prosecutors argued that money played a central role, and once again, they claimed Stewart had attempted to disguise the killing as something else. In 2022, Ian Stewart was tried for the murder of Diane Stewart. The jury heard evidence about the car crash, the medical findings, and the prosecution's allegation that the collision had been staged. After deliberating, the jury found him guilty. Stewart was convicted of murdering his previous wife, making him a double murderer in the eyes of the law. The case that had begun with the disappearance of a successful author had ultimately led investigators to conclude that two women had been killed years apart. What makes the Bailey case so extraordinary is where the truth was found. For months, investigators searched for a missing woman. Public appeals were broadcast. Her fiancé spoke of his concern. Friends hoped she would be found alive. All the while, Helen's remains were concealed beneath the very home she shared, with the man publicly asking for help. It was a revelation that stunned and transformed the case into one of the most disturbing examples of a crime hidden in plain sight. The Helen Bailey case continues to fascinate investigators and true crime researchers for one overwhelming reason: the concealment. Many murder cases involve attempts to hide evidence. Few involve a victim being hidden beneath the home that they shared with the killer, while public appeals for help continued above ground. That contrast between appearance and reality is what made this case so memorable. To neighbours, friends and the wider public, Ian Stewart appeared to be searching for his missing fiancée. Behind that appearance, detectives later concluded he already knew exactly where she was. When people discuss this case, the phrase that often comes to mind is hidden in plain sight. For months, the search focused outward. Investigators looked for a missing woman. Appeals asked the public for information. Friends hoped for answers. And in the end, the answer was simply found beneath the very property that had been part of the investigation from the beginning. The Helen Bailey case serves as a reminder that some of the most disturbing crimes are not hidden in distant places. Sometimes they are concealed within the ordinary spaces of everyday life, protected by trust, routine, and the assumption that nothing could be wrong. Thank you for watching this documentary on the murder of Helen Bailey. We've covered this case respectfully, focusing on the known facts, the investigation, and the court findings that led to the convictions. If you found this video informative and would like to see more in-depth true crime documentaries from the UK and beyond, please consider subscribing to Midnight Archives. If you have any thoughts on the case, feel free to leave a respectful comment below. Until the next time, stay safe, and thank you for joining me here on Midnight Archives.